Hello. Welcome to this video about retrieval practice and the testing effect from the MSc in Medical Education at the Swansea University Medical School. What I hope you're able to do by the end of this video is first to describe the core principles of retrieval practice and the testing effect, then to identify some applications of retrieval practice and the testing effect to your own studying or teaching practice, and then to link retrieval practice to the biology of memory. We'll start with a basic punchline about retrieval practice and the testing effect, and that is that practice tests are a more effective way of learning than restudying. Students who take practice tests as part of their studying or revision do better than students who just reread a textbook. When we say do better, that means their learning persists for longer, they're better able to transfer it to other contexts. There's a lot of detail in what it means to say a test. It doesn't just mean taking exams. We'll get onto some of that towards the end of the video, but before we do, I just want to talk about the basic comparison that retrieval practice is often compared against. Restudying is basically rereading a textbook, although there are other ways that students study. They highlight bits of textbooks, they underline them. Why is retrieval practice most commonly compared to restudying? It's because that's what students do. In surveys where students are asked, how do you study? What are the most common ways in which you study? And what's your number one way of studying? Restudying comes out top. And restudying is basically defined as rereading notes and textbooks and other instructional materials. That turns out to be a not very effective way of studying, and retrieval practice, in all of the research we've seen, and there's a lot of it, consistently turns out to be more effective. There's some detail about how and why retrieval practice is more effective. It's not just effective in the laboratory, it's not just effective in controlled experimental settings, it's more effective in authentic teaching settings. Students who are given advice to engage in retrieval practice and advice on how to do it, they do better than students who just then restudy. It's better than other methods that are related to retrieval practice, and we'll come on to what some of those are towards the end. But things that we're commonly advocating students to do, things like making mind maps or concept maps, they tap into some of the same biology as retrieval practice, but it's not as effective as taking practice tests and quizzes. Retrieval practice enhances transfer. Students who learn some information in one particular context, if they use retrieval practice, they're better able to transfer that knowledge to another context. It's also effective at all levels of education. The benefits of retrieval practice have been shown in kindergarten and preschool children, all the way through to adult learners, including university students. It's a very important question then about what it means to say retrieval practice and a test. It doesn't have to be a high-stakes summative exam. It can be anything that does what we call bring to mind relevant pieces of information. To understand what it means to bring something to mind, we probably have to go back over some of the core principles of learning and memory that underpin retrieval practice and the testing effect. There are three basic types of memory that are important for understanding retrieval practice. The first is short-term memory. Basically, we're processing huge amounts of sensory information at any one time. The things that we want to learn that we're processing, we want to get down into long-term memory. And long-term memory has a very large capacity for storing learned information. The problem is, for anything that we want to learn to get into long-term memory, it has to make its way through working memory. Working memory has a very limited capacity and can only hold a small amount of information for a very short period of time. The way the information gets into working memory is that we pay attention to it. If we're then lucky enough to learn it, it transfers from working memory into long-term memory. And in other videos, particularly those about cognitive load theory and other practices, we've covered a lot of principles that can facilitate this transition from working memory into long-term memory. The key thing for retrieval practice is what happens during that transition. Once information goes into working memory, one of the things that it does, very simplistically, is it reaches down into long-term memory and looks for things that are similar. Looks for places where to put the information that we're trying to learn, places that it will fit best, places that fit where it looks like the stuff that's already there. What retrieval practice does is it facilitates bringing up those similar things into working memory and into an active processing form that allows new to-be-learned information to be stuck in the most appropriate place. Perhaps the best way for me to explain this is to give you a very simple example. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read out a list of words. I'm going to read it out quite quickly. with enough time for you to remember each of the words. And all I want you to do is try and remember them as I go through them. Once I've read out the list of words, I'm going to come back and ask you to remember a word or two that was on that list. Okay? Here we go. The list of words then is as follows: smooth, bumpy, road, tough, sandpaper, jagged, ready, coarse, uneven, riders, rugged, sand, boards, ground, and grave. All right. It's a list of about 15 words. Do you think you can remember them all? More specifically, if I asked you whether you thought the word rough was on that list, would you say yes? In experimental studies, 83% of people in an experimental group who were asked whether or not rough was in that previous list of words said yes. The same group of people were asked to then just write down all the words that they had heard. 53% of them wrote down the word rough, even though it wasn't on the list. The reason why so many people recall that word that wasn't on the list tells us a lot about how we learn and how we store memories and how we store information that we've learned. Here again is the list of words. You can see they're all words that are related to each other. More importantly, they're all related to the word rough. Rough road, rough ready, rough ground, rough riders, rugged, jagged, sandpaper, and so on. They're all related to each other, and that's how they're stored in long-term memory. There are basically connections between all of them. Not just between these words, but between a whole set of other words that are very similar, including the word rough. It's not just the words that are related to each other, it's our understanding of them, the meaning of them, and our experience of them. When we learn about these things, they're all learned in a way that's connected to meaning and understanding and experience of similar things. The connections between some things are stronger than others. If we have a rough beard, then the links between those two words and experiences might be stronger than if we don't have a beard. If we work a lot with sandpaper that's rough, then the link between the word rough and sandpaper might be stronger than if we don't. This then starts to lead us on to an explanation for how retrieval practice works. If you've repeatedly worked with rough sandpaper, then you've basically practiced the learning of an association between those two different concepts. Retrieval practice does something similar. It forces a form of practice by exposing students to tests or quizzes or some other concept or approach that brings things to mind. Specifically, what we think retrieval practice does is it strengthens connections between relevant associations and weakens connections between irrelevant associations. There's a controversy about which or both of these approaches actually underpins the retrieval practice. Neither of those are perhaps necessarily important for us as practitioners. There's a third principle that probably is a bit more relevant, and that's that retrieval practice forces a sort of desirable difficulty. It makes learning slightly more challenging. There's a whole suite of approaches to learning and teaching that can come under this approach called desirable difficulty, basically make things a little more challenging than rereading a textbook. We'll come on to some of those in other videos. As always in these videos, we're taking a pragmatic approach as part of our model of evidence-based education, where we consider the most useful evidence from a pragmatic perspective in combination with our judgment about it and the context in which it's going to be applied. With this in mind, then, the question we really want to ask is retrieval practice useful? And obviously, with any sort of question like that, the answer is somewhat subjective. But from our perspective, on the basis of the evidence we've reviewed, the answer is yes. That's largely because it's very practical for educators. It's very easy for us to build in opportunities for students to engage in retrieval practice. We just have to write them some pop quizzes or some practice tests or some other opportunities for bringing information to mind. It's also really useful for students themselves. We can give them advice about how to engage in retrieval practice just simply by advising them to build their own flashcards or write their own quizzes or take any quizzes that we might write for them or that they might find online. It's very important in all those cases that the quizzes they take are accurate and that they check the accuracy of the information and of their answers when they're engaging with it. There's some questions about the utility of retrieval practice. One of them comes from this idea about whether or not it needs to be an exam or a test. This gets to the heart of the distinction between the terms retrieval practice and the testing effect. The psychologists who've worked out this process, certainly in some of the initial research, would always refer to it as the testing effect because it demonstrated that testing improved learning. There's a concern over the use of the phrase "a testing effect." First of all, because lots of students get very anxious about taking tests and exams. And secondly, because it doesn't just require tests, or doesn't just need tests for the process to be effective. All that we need is something that promotes retrieval, this process of bringing to mind. There are lots of ways that we can do this. Taking tests is the most obvious of them, but they don't have to be high-stakes summative tests. They can be low-stakes, no-stakes, or other sorts of formative tests, or even just quizzes added on at the end of a lecture or given as part of revision materials and other study materials. The process of writing tests is also a useful thing for students to do. By writing questions for themselves or writing questions for their peers, they are bringing information to mind. Making flashcards is another very common way of getting to this point. Flashcards where there's a question on one side of the card and the answer on the other side of the card, and students can test themselves or test each other. As long as they do actually engage with the question and not just look at the answer before they know it, then they are going to get some of the benefits of retrieval practice. There's another approach which is slightly more open-ended. We just ask students to write down everything they know about a particular topic. That's another really good way of bringing something to mind. It can be a good way of starting a study session or a class. Just spend 5 minutes thinking about or writing down everything that you know. This whole process and the concept of retrieval practice is often thought about in terms of quizzes and tests, and therefore thought about in terms of multiple choice questions, which are perhaps best for testing knowledge of facts. But this whole process works for much broader and deeper types of learning about concepts and other, what we might call higher order approaches to education. Retrieval practice works there as well. And asking students to write down what they know about a particular topic is another really good way of getting to that. There's also a basic dose-response curve to retrieval practice. The more students engage with it, the more powerful the effect is, and the more they're going to benefit from it. The more quizzes they take, the better, basically. There are some other benefits to retrieval practice that are also worth mentioning, because it also gets to some of the concerns about retrieval practice as an approach. Students who repeatedly take practice tests, perhaps understandably then, report less anxiety about the summative tests. Basically, students get used to taking tests. There's a big concern, particularly in UK higher education, that we over-assess our students, and we're often encouraged to reduce the amount of assessments that they do. It's possibly more useful for us and for our students to encourage them to take more tests, more low stakes or no stakes or practice tests, more tests in general, so that the overall burden of assessment, the overall weight of an assessment when it comes to summative tests is reduced. Have lots of small tests rather than a few big ones, basically, can reduce the amount of anxiety students experience when it comes to the summative assessments. The students who engage in part of their own self-directed learning in retrieval practice tend to be the students who do better on exams, particularly when it comes to high-stakes summative exams. There's some studies with medical students. The students who were more likely to engage in retrieval practice then did better on the high-stakes medical licensing exams. This can be part of the fact that they probably learned a bit better, but possibly also because they've become much more used to taking tests. Another perhaps more indirect benefit of retrieval practice is it's a very basic but important and powerful form of feedback. If students take a quiz or do some other activity where they bring to mind and test themselves on what they know about a topic, they get a good sense of what they actually know. It can also be useful for educators as well to get some feedback. What do our students actually know about this? And here's a test that demonstrates it. Finally, retrieval practice is perhaps best understood as a form of learning. The students who engage in retrieval practice do better on tests, but in many of the studies where this has been tested, they don't do better straight away. In experiments where students are either asked to restudy or reread a particular text, or are given a test on it, the students who do the restudying might do better on an immediate test of knowledge. The benefits of retrieval practice tend to be seen later on, i.e. the learning is a little bit deeper, it's a little bit more persistent, and as we said earlier, transfer more easily to other contexts. That's a summary then of some of the benefits of retrieval practice. It's a really useful thing to do for students and for educators. It's really easy for us to build in some of the basic benefits of it by just writing a few practice quizzes and tests for our students. Here then are some of the references we've used. Most of these are to the basic research that underpins some of the benefits of retrieval practice. There's also a number of good sites that explain this in slightly more practical detail, and I'd always encourage you to go to the Learning Scientist site. They've got a lot of useful information and resources to help you with lots of different aspects of the science of learning, including retrieval practice. If you've got any questions, here's my email address. Feel free to send them to me. If not, I'll see you in another video. Bye-bye.